Welcome to the fifth parallel session on Toward Green Democracy. Really honored to be with the distinguished panelists we have here and everyone in the audience. We're going to try to keep this as interactive as possible, especially since we have a little bit smaller, intimate, but committed group. So, was that, yeah? Oh, and online as well. Wonderful. We're going to continue with the hybrid environment and make it work. One of the things that we say often in the Public Governance Committee is that countries face horizontal challenges, and yet we're organized with vertical organizations. And I can't think of a more of a better example than climate change as an area where we're going to need to use all the tools that we currently have and probably some new ones as well, both within our own countries but also globally, to be able to meet the expectations of our citizens. So today we have panelists with us. We have Ms. Sam Tansen, our Minister of Justice from Luxembourg, who is our host. Mr. Osian Smith, who is the State Minister at the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, responsible for public procurement and e-government in Ireland. And we have Ms. Carrie Ann Jones, who is our Deputy Secretary General at OECD. And we have Mr. Juha Leppänen, who is our Chief Executive from Demos in Helsinki, Finland. So I'm going to start by asking them a question to kind of begin the dialogue, and then we'll have a second round and then open it up for Q&A from the audience. The first question I wanted to start with is really kind of looking internally within government. What are some of the whys and hows that government needs to be able to change how we operate to achieve the climate and environmental goals that we've established? So I'll go ahead and begin with Ms. Tansen.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and I'm going to switch to French, so if you need translation, just stick that in your ear. Je trouve que la
So I think that the question is of paramount importance because there's a question we should raise on an everyday basis at the government. So maybe I should wait that people hold their headsets now. Can you hear the English translation? So there are several elements in my response. First of all, climate, protecting natural resources, for example. These are key questions that should be handled at the moment. But unfortunately, they are sort of disregarded in a way because of other very important crises we're going through while we are having our debate, and which we already mentioned this morning. However, we should bear in mind the fact that we should guarantee our planet for the future generations in order to avoid poverty spreading and migratory flows. And so what should we do and how should we proceed? Well, as a government, I mean, we should, of course, we should give the good example, and we should offer measures we're going to apply in ourselves, but not only this, I mean, we should also try to get the whole population with us, or a major part of the population with us. And we noticed that the population's citizens have a tendency of being more ambitious, and even more ambitious than we are expecting. So that it would be possible to implement an ambitious policy. But then we have to convince, we have to work with the citizens. And last but not least, we should also bear in mind that protecting natural resources may raise issues in terms of social equity. And so we have to do everything possible in order not to strengthen and widen the gap on the social at social level. So we should keep this social aspect in our mind and support this through financial measures. I could illustrate this with 3 elements, if I have enough time to do so. The process, first of all, in terms of mobility, for example, when new decisions are being taken, with new bus networks or a new national mobility plan in the short term, there is a public consultation which takes place. There's a proposal which is submitted, and then the relevant minister goes to the various regions and then takes into account the various observations made by the various citizens, which is very important. Also, the civil society is also very important. We have to listen to what the experts say in this respect. So everything dealing with the climate, sustainable development, for example, there's an upper council with 50 members who support and assist the government in developing these policies. So this is just to give you an overview, general overview.
Hear how you're leveraging procurement and some of the other tools you have within Ireland to make progress on your climate goals.
Yeah, so how can we use procurement to advance green goals? You know, the Irish government, I'm sure this is the same as in other countries, is the largest customer. You know, we would spend maybe 16 billion euros a year and of government money, and we have to direct that in a way that either is bad for the environment or is good for the environment. But I suppose the way that procurement has built up, the goals of procurement, the basis of the whole thing is get value for money for your country, get good quality, and spend money in a fair and transparent way. So those are the 3 goals, and we're coming along then and saying, okay, there's another one. You know, you also need to protect the environment or do something that's good for climate change. So it's hard to get people to change, and it is hard to get people to, you know, to do a different job from the one that they've learned to do. So what we have to do is make it easy, make that the default, give them the easiest route they can, provide training, and also to reward people who do well, to produce league tables and say, well, these are the departments that are doing best at green procurement, and also to eliminate the old ways. So what we found was we would bring in a whole system whereby you could procure a building in a very green way, but we'd also left the old frameworks for doing it the old way, and people would just, if you leave them the choice, they're going to continue with business as usual. So that's part of it. Part of it was just to make sure that we're getting rid of the old thing, and it is really important to do, because if you start, if the citizens see that the government is going green and is spending in a green way, we have a significant effect in the economy, significant market power, but also we're leading by example. And finally, we are learning ourselves as government, as public administrators, as politicians, what's actually involved in the challenges of going green. So there's no point in me telling people to drive an electric vehicle, but I've got a diesel vehicle and I've never charged it and I've never had to go through the problems. I've never walked a mile in somebody else's shoes. Or for me to say, you need to reduce your travel, but then I'm getting a private jet or something. So it is really important that we're doing those things so we can make the policies. So that's for me is
Right. Thank you. And we have Deputy Secretary Jones with us as well, and you've seen this from a few different angles in your career, so I'd love to hear how OECD is contributing to this.
Thank you, Dustin, and I'm very happy to be on this panel. I think this is a very important topic. There's really 2 ways, I think, when you think about this at OECD. First of all, because OECD is cross-disciplinary, in some ways it reflects governments. You know, there's an economics group, there's a education group, there's a environment group, and the horizontal project on climate change is looking at some of the very issues that governments are looking at, and how do you integrate these? And we're seeing some of the same challenges. How do you get the economics into the environmental piece? How do you make sure you're dealing with the social issues? And how do you make sure you're dealing with the educational issues? So in that way, our horizontal effort is kind of mirroring what governments are going through and then trying to inform some of those policies. But very specific to reinforcing the democracy initiative, when this was being discussed with members and thought about what the elements should be, it was clear that the nexus between this very complex problem and governance was not a trivial point. It had to be part of thinking about how do you look at the democratic model of things, how do you make sure you can have citizens make these changes, as my colleague was saying, it's just a very challenging question. We realized it's a dimension that was missing from the initiative, and it was required of government and the wider public sector to understand how do you steer this particular challenging transition. So about a year ago, when OECD country delegates and the Public Governance Committee, which you are very familiar with, and the Regulatory Policy Committee and the Committee of Senior Budget Officials, they all discussed this issue, and they've come together, and that's one of the chapters in the book that was talked about today, Building Trust and Reinforcing Democracy. There's a chapter just on greening. So the short answer is it has to be integrated, but it's a new kind of issue. Our indicators show that across different tools, governments are in fact gearing up to go green. For example, green budgeting has increased. As of 2021, of the 38 OECD countries, 14 had implemented green budgeting practices. The 2021 regulatory policy outlook shows that the OECD member countries and the European Union have gotten increasingly better at requiring regulators to consider environmental impacts of regulation. And I think we've seen that across many governments. We also see positive evidence of countries aligning their long-term infrastructure plans with environmental policy and implying good business practices and frameworks in public procurement, as was just mentioned. However, beyond this evidence, we have learned there's a clear need for deeper and broader transformation of public governance to deliver and implement green policy measures. It's because we are seeing that it's so challenging. There's special attention that's needed in 3 areas we see. Kind of steering and building consensus and trust for delivering green in the next decade, and then using the right tools for climate and environmental action, and then, as has been mentioned, leading by example, because the government is often such a huge player in procurement and other areas. On the basis of the framing, the Public Governance Committee approved an action plan on governing green. And this includes a set of actions that governments can undertake for each of these areas. So I think we're in the process of understanding, we're in the process of studying this, but we're doing it sort of 2 ways, by modeling it ourselves and getting better policies, but also trying to look very specifically from the governance perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. And the leading by example is a good segue actually over to Juha, who published recently a review of humble government, which I love that term. I circled it as soon as I came across it, describing how a humble approach to policy making can help governments in building long-term policy making when dealing with wicked problems like this. So I'd love to hear a little bit more on some of the takeaways from that.
No, thank you, Dustin. And first of all, I'm really, really happy to see OECD putting so much effort in this line of work. I think this climate crisis is, by definition, a governance crisis, a crisis of collective action. And I think this topic of green or climate governance will be one of the most important topics for this in coming decades. In the OECD study, the survey said that over half of the population support climate action, yet roughly 1/3 believe in government's capacities. And I think it's roughly right. I think it's very fair to doubt the engine. And a lot of our work is on that level. And the challenge there is that you work with processes that are very, very codified. And if we talk about budgeting, there will always, or for a long time still, be a methodological superiority for ministries of finance to assess fiscal implications versus ecological implications. So humble governance essentially was one attempt to provide hypotheses for that, like fairly practical hypotheses in terms of how governments could reform policy-making cycle, essentially. So it's based on the theoretical work from Charles F. Sable from the University of Columbia. He's been studying governance with empiric examples from different case studies in different parts of the world, from California to some of the global governance schemes, such as the Montreal Protocol, and essentially codified that into a theory called experimentalist governance. So together with Chuck and with the Finnish government, around 3 years ago, we started to work on how would that look like as an application on policy design. Because based on those empiric examples, what Charles Sable has been able to do is to identify 4 principles 4 functions that need to be in place in a policymaking cycle that is able to actually deliver on long-term future-oriented reforms. One is a function to strengthen consensus. Another one is a constant reflection and identification loop on incentives. The third one on peer learning between the key actors in the industries. And a fourth one, a revision mechanism, because in many cases the goals that we put in place are not the right goals. So there needs to be an explicit way to actually tackle that. So essentially the humility there refers to humility in front of knowledge, humility in front of collaboration with the actors that are actually able to achieve those goals, but also humility as accountability, because we're also facing some of the false dichotomies of the 20th century. One being that having directionality and a proactive stance by a democratic mandate, by a government, does not necessarily mean that implementation should be centralized. So you can have directionality, but at the same time be experimentalist and collaborative in terms of how you move forward. So that's essentially the framework, but then as we know, all issues are contextual and particular, so there's no blueprint. So what we hope that work would help to do is to help design then the more specific mechanisms through which those 4 functions can actually be delivered. So that's essentially what the humble governance work is about. We've been doing now cases in Finland with sustainable timber construction, with our government, with the local entities, with the industries, within the state of Colorado, in the implementation of the Biden infrastructure package and so forth. So it's in a way a working progress that hopefully provides learnings for others as well.
Great, thank you for that. And I just realized while I introduced all our panelists, I didn't introduce myself. So I am Dustin Brown. I'm the Deputy Assistant Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget and Chair of the OECD Public Governance Committee, where we are trying to do a real integrative approach for all the different sub-bodies that are within the Public Governance Committee, focusing exactly on these issues. So really appreciate those insights. I actually want to stay with Juha for just another minute on kind of the second round of questions, which focus more on the external kind of relationships we need to build with our citizens. Obviously, trust in government is going to be key if we're going to make progress on meeting citizens' expectations and have success here. So Finland is an interesting case study, and we've heard it referred to as the Finnish paradox in terms of levels of trust in government in Finland is quite high, but people's belief that they can influence the political process or policy process is low relative to maybe other countries. Could you maybe share any insights you have on that dynamic?
No, thanks, Dustin. That's a really, really interesting question. And I think there's a bunch of different conventional hypotheses on why that is, ranging from the fact that the Finnish political system adapts rather slowly, meaning that there are segments in the population that don't feel political efficacy and capability to have an influence in the political system, ranging from the social institutions and the welfare state basically providing the decline of trust may be a bit slower than in some of the other. We're also seeing the decline, but it's just slower than in some of the other places. But I'd like to actually explore 3 bit more speculative hypotheses, because those might be more useful for the discussion, because in a way we are learning from that paradox every year and with every survey and every study moving ahead. One is that in a way having high trust in institutions can mean having lower efficacy and need to have an influence on those. And this was most likely particularly true in the beginning of COVID, for instance. So in a crisis, that is something that very easily happens if you trust your institutions too much. And I think that is very relevant if we talk about the climate crisis, because if we only think of the formal ways to participate, democracy becomes easily very performative. And I think we should more explore what democracy means as a cultural trait in the context of the transformations and crisis where we are. The early days of democratic literature were much about that. They were much about how, and specifically in the US, that was also much documented. And I think that level of everyday democracy in the context of the climate crisis is something to explore further. The second is that the Finnish political system is still fairly consensus-oriented, and that can also mean that there's a lot of very hegemonic positions politically within the society. So I can easily recognize a fact that it may feel really challenging to challenge some of, for instance, premises on economic policy. The alternative ideas take a longer time to go if there is a constant consensus mechanisms building up from an electoral cycle to an electoral cycle. But then the third one might be the most relevant hypothesis in regards to the context that we're talking about here. Because if we think about the climate crisis, the argumentation is often about what a nation state, a small country such as Finland, can do. It's really similar with economic policy and globalization. So you cannot taxate, you cannot put in forward a variety of different mechanisms. So it just might be that it's the government that lost parts of its efficacy, not necessarily the citizens themselves. And this is something because we work with governments from different countries every year, and it's very much reflected in the ethos and the discourse and the language used. So governments very easily use the language of enabling change, for instance, which is fine in stable conditions. But if we talk about crisis or significant transformations, people expect more. They expect accountability. So it might be that there are that level of reflections that people somehow are able to percept, and with that then have a position that creates a lack of efficacy on political action in the Finnish context.
That's definitely one of the themes that comes up in our PGC meetings is how do we take the way governments manage in a crisis and apply it to kind of the day-to-day, maybe not always most urgent issues, but long-term systemic ones, because I think we do have a lot we could learn from those. Let's come to our host country and hear maybe some from Luxembourg about how you're taking steps to build trust and get buy-in on the kind of consensus that's going to be needed to achieve these long-term goals.
Oui, si je...
Well, actually, coming back to and focusing to the topic regarding our panel in terms of sustainable development, then we developed, at the beginning of this year, actually, we created a kind of Citizen Climate Committee, which was selected together with the university in order to guarantee demographic representativity of the population. And that is, there are 60 people selected and 40 extra members, and they developed a full range of measures they submit to act in terms of sustainable development, protection also of natural resources in order to try and cope with the climate change. So I think that this is something which is really important because the real need within the population to act, and also because, as I said before, my feeling is always that the policies, the politicians are somehow afraid and are not aware enough of what is within the population. This is why it's very important to listen, or to give a voice, and to hear also, to listen also to the population and hear what they have to say. And this was a real structured process, supported with various exchange of views and with a document which submitted to the government, which has always been debated within the deputy chamber, and now it's up to the government and the policies to make to have these measures are being integrated in our future policies. Another example may be also at a different level. We also support the municipalities because I think that the local level, which is the closest level to the citizens, where there is a lot of impact which can take place. We support the municipalities via the pact with the municipalities, developing policies, protecting the resources, protecting the environment. And we help them to act in this direction. So we try to raise awareness at the closest possible to the population so that this topic is always up to date and always on the top of the agenda regarding the decision-making process at local level. Thank you.
Bernie, and hear from Ireland on what steps they're taking.
What steps we're taking to improve
trust and consensus among citizens to deal with climate change?
Look, we have a national objective which is very clear, which is to cut emissions 50% by 2030. So we have a very straightforward and a very straightforward goal that everybody buys into. All the political parties accepted it, the general public very high support, and there are generally very high levels of trust in Ireland in government. So we're lucky with that, and a high support for EU membership and so on. But then you get down to the next level of the things we actually have to do. So we make an action plan, and then we allocate it to people, and then people find, oh, you want to do something in my area that disturbs my lifestyle, and now there's resistance, and that is nothing new. Politics is always like that. It does, even if you were building a public sanitation system, everybody wants public sanitation. They don't want the large facility next door to their house, and that's going to be the same for you and me as well. So we shouldn't judge people on that. But the reality is that there is going to be a big lot of political work to be done to get the actual steps to happen in people's lives. And one of the main things that people resist is any change to their own lifestyle. And there was all this hope during the pandemic that people could change their lifestyles really fast and they would take immediate change. But that's when they thought that their grandparents were going to die, you know, and you could say to your children, you can't go outside to the party because your granny might die if that happens. Whereas now, the roles are reversed. We're asking the older people to do something to protect the younger people, but it's a little bit further in the future, and we're not getting the daily number of people who've died every day on the TV as we did before. So it's harder to get the motivation. One thing I'd say is that asking people not to do things is nowhere near as effective as suggesting to people what they could do. So making positive suggestions to people. And sometimes, you know, if all of our climate actions are framed as things that we're forbidding you to do, or taxes, or you know, banning things, then it's not going to work because people are being backed into a corner. Whereas if you say, look, I'm giving you this very positive route. For example, in Ireland, we introduced an 80% grant to insulate your house in some ways, or we cut the public transport fares in half for young people. That if you can bring in a very positive change and say, well, look, here's something nice. Now, obviously those things cost money sometimes, and you might have to have something that balances it. But we really need to have a positive set of things for people to move towards. And also, I suppose we need to say to people, we need to go beyond, yes, we were all agreed we need to do something about climate change. We're all agreed we need to cut the emissions. But when this comes to your area, can you please support it? Sometimes the bit you get a lot of, it appears from social media perhaps, or it appears from the people who show up at a public meeting that everybody is against it. And in fact, it's a very vocal minority. And so politicians are sometimes deceived into thinking that the public are against a particular climate action simply because the minority is so vocal, and that's what, you know, you were talking about public participation and public consultation, and one of the problems with public consultation is that if we allow it to be people coming to us instead of us going out to them. So if we say, look, oh, you public participation, just email this address and, you know, send in your comments, or, you know, come along to a meeting. But the people who come to the meeting are not representative, and the people who fill in the forms are not representative. We actually, and as a politician, I know I can only find out the reality by going out and stopping people on the street or knocking on people's doors and coming to people who are not coming to me directly and saying, how do you really feel? So that's a pitfall. It's a risk that we will be deceived that the loudest voices represent the majority when they don't.
Yeah, how you connect the actions to the outcomes, I think, is a really interesting question. And one of the ways, I think, to do that effectively is by having a good evidence base that really shows people kind of the connection between the activities you could take and then the final results.
I'll give you an example of that. You know, if you want to shut down, a straightforward climate action is you're going to shut down the street outside a school in the morning to cars. And you're going to say the last 100 meters you got to walk it or something. And I've seen that done very effectively in cities where they did a lot of air pollution monitoring first. They provided the data to people. They said, look, there's really high levels of air pollution outside the place where you are delivering your children to school in the morning. It's affecting the parents and the children. And for that reason, we're going to have to cut this down. And then you show afterwards the outcome is great reduction, right, happier children going in. And part of getting this idea across to people or persuading people is to have a really good vision, to sell to people the beautiful future of the children happily arriving in school, walking down, cycling down, and so on for the last 100 meters, and that you have that, that you can present that as the happy future rather than the frightening, alarming future.
So not just about climate kind of broadly, but also about the quality of life people have
all
in
about
terms
quality
of
life.
health and and happiness. Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent. Kieran, I'd love to hear what OECD would say in terms of the evidence kind of base for some of these actions and what insights you've been able to identify through the research OECD's been doing.
Thanks, Dustin. Well, I think that, what we're talking about is the whole idea of trust here, so that government can take action. And with governing green, clearly those are big actions, and so these two are very tightly linked together. And OECD has, looked at these in the survey that has been mentioned. I mean, the clear linkage of this becomes obvious when you realize that governments are struggling with a very difficult backdrop, right? They're trying to tackle very hard climate problems that are critically dependent on state action, but also dependent on other governments' action around the planet, as well as everything in the background, right? We have the inflation, social and economic reforms that are carried out, and all the question about trust in public institutions. So the context is making trust a very important element of all of this. And I think that what we see, as has been mentioned, that while there is trust in the government recognizing it, actually taking actions and making it happen is not there. So there's this reality base. And I think my colleagues are talking about really what has to be happening. You have to bridge that reality, sort of between what they think can be done and what is actually done. And I think what is going to be happening at OECD is there's a new trust survey coming, which will happen regularly, and climate was one of the questions on it. And so you begin to generate the data here to say, okay, is this getting better? And I think that's where the data comes into play, and you begin to also see, well, are these the right questions? I think there'll be questions in the future that might have to look at this issue of local versus national. How do you deal globally? But I think we're just beginning to touch on this. How do you link the two, governing green and trust, to make a difference? So it's just the beginning of this, and that's part of what this whole discussion is about. Where do we go from here to get this data, and how granular does it have to be? At what level do you get this? So I think we're starting, and it's coming, but we have a lot to learn about trust in actually having action on climate.
Excellent. All right. Well, the panelists have done their job in keeping remarks brief and to the point, which I really appreciate, which leaves an opportunity for us to hear from the audience, which is filled out nicely. I'm pleased to report. Good showing here. So I'd love it if you could just introduce yourself, where you're from, and then your question, and we'll have our panelists respond. Yeah. Just wait for the mic just a second. There you go.
I'm Yilmaz Arguden, chair of the Governance Committee of Business at OECD. We are talking about trust, but in general sense, it seems like. There are different dimensions of trust. Trust for the integrity of the government. Trust for the capability of performance. Trust for following the processes, rule of law, and so forth. And trust for fairness. They're all different. So we have to make sure that we are talking about which trust, and we have to build all of those trusts, as a matter of fact. And one of the things that I see, particularly with respect to climate thing, is that we think that climate is cross-cutting, but a new issue, and we are not considering all the other activities that we are doing in the government to handle this particular issue. We need a total restructuring of our thought process. For example, people work with incentives, right? Incentives influence people's behavior very well. As the minister mentioned, that if you give them positive incentives, if you give them information, they change their behavior and so forth. But right now, our tax systems are basically based on what we can measure easily. And we tax those things that are measured easily. And we are not considering collecting the same amount of taxes without increasing it from negative externalities rather than positive externalities. Perhaps it was not possible 20 years ago because we didn't have the technology to measure and so forth. However, right now, especially over a period of time, let's change 20% of our tax income to negative externalities in the next 2 years. And in the next decade, We can have all of them based on negative externalities, which will have a lot more impact than what we are trying to do with separate activities on the climate change. So we need to think about how we are collecting resources, how we are utilizing it, not only for climate, but also for fairness with respect to different parts of the society and so forth. Try to think about restructuring how we are governing and how we are conducting the government could give us very significant impact rather than looking at issue by issue to these things. And it can also improve trust in all the dimensions that I mentioned. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Anyone have a reaction to that, or do you want to keep taking more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
On the different kinds of trust, I mean, I think that trust in integrity is more basic than trust in performance. So you might have a view that your politicians or your government is trying to do the right thing, but then you might think that their performance is bad and they're failing. That's not the same as I think my government and my politicians are actually bad people who don't care about me and are just looking after themselves. And then that's when you have real problems in your country. I think it's different when if you don't like the performance of your government and then you just vote for another one. That's how democracy works. So I think that's not as worrying. I think that there are different levels of trust, is what I'm saying.
Carrie Ann?
Yes, a couple of things. When you talked about trust, I think there's another element here that I wanted to add, and that's people's trust that their voices are being heard. That's the inclusiveness, but it's also to the point that the minister made, well, which voices and how do you make sure you're getting a real range of voices, not just the voices that are coming to sort of put a negative vote out there. How do you have a whole of society discussion? The other thing that I wanted to say is that, one of the challenges with climate is its complexity, absolute complexity. And while I think everyone has ideas what can be done, there's multiple ways of doing this. And so I think it's very difficult sometimes for the public to say, well, how come this policy and not that policy? Which policy works? And one of the areas where OECD is trying to move out into this area that's very complicated is it has this new activity called the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches. And that's to actually have an inventory of all the different approaches and try to say, well, what are they doing? And I think we have this challenge with climate, with the complexity of it, the effort to have simpler political messages and all of the choices. So I think getting more and more data out there and building trust at the same time, it's just going to be an ongoing process back and forth here.
Yeah, I heard a comment this morning of just how important it is for governments to be explaining and communicating, and you just can't do that enough. Any other reactions, or we can go back to questions? Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, quickly on that, because it's a really, really good point. And it's really interesting because studies constantly seem to show, like this fall, Common Sense did a study of UK, France, Poland, and Germany, basically saying that people want to have immediate policies to mitigate the concerns on cost of living, yet still support climate policies and climate agendas. Similarly, studies on Yellow Vest show exactly the same. So my fundamental worry is complete loss of trust in government's capability to actually solve the climate crisis. Because they can't. It's very, very true. It's not something that a single government can do. So basically 2 suggestions on that would be exactly as you're suggesting. In the end, these things require fairly constant reimagination of the governance scheme, because in the end, current economic policy is a lot about agreed what is trusted type of measurement models, so as we all know. So similarly, but that requires quite a lot of leadership, because it takes a road and mistakes to get there. But that process is the process that I feel is now emerging, that it needs just to be codified and explicated, made sense of. But secondly, I think we need a line of work on innovating, in a way, these multi-level governance vehicles. So what are the vehicles that are not just about aggregating nation states in the multilateral process, but actually trying to go to a phenomenon or a challenge through a mission framework, through industrial policy framework, in which we're actually able to solve and also embed new participatory mechanisms while solving those challenges.
Just briefly, effectivement, quand j'ai regardé les...
When I looked at the figures you're speaking about before, I just wondered, Luxembourg, who benefits from a quite important level of trust, people do not really trust the fact that in terms of climate, we're going to take the necessary steps. And so I just thought maybe they think we are a small country, we are not able to react as easily. I mean, or is it because of this specific field of competence? And so I think that in the next survey, maybe we'll be able to refine the questions. And second thing also I wanted to react is it's not the fact that it's not about trust. I mean, it's sort of general climate. So the question we raise regarding what we are debating upon belong to a wider context, because the Luxembourg, for example, asked for assessment from the OECD regarding the COVID crisis. And one of the conclusions was that communication was about communication. Communication is what is most important. We have to communicate about what we are doing in order to avoid people to lose trust. Still, I think that in the climate field, I mean, this field is specific, and there's a lot of fear linked to this, because we are really afraid of what's going to happen in the future. And this fear is fundamental for many people. And so maybe this is why we try to avoid various elements, or maybe we try to say, as you said before, I mean, there's nothing we can do. And here again, I mean, we have to tell the people that we can do some things. We have the necessary tools to restore the situation, but we have to act right now. We have to join our effort. I mean, it's sort of joint effort.
All right, I see two. We're going to go ahead and take maybe both these questions here, and then quick reactions, and then I'm getting the cue that we need to begin wrapping up.
Okay.
Thank
you.
Gentleman left.
Sorry, thank you. I'm Luis Fernando Medina. I am the ambassador of Colombia to the OECD, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I had a question. I noticed that the panel, of course, because of the provenance, was mostly focused on climate change from the point of view of industrialized countries, and of course the perspective of mostly consumers, with of course, although Finland poses a host of great examples of management of common resources and so on, from which developing countries can learn. And I was very interested about the remarks that you made on Finland. But precisely that brought me into mind a question about how to build trust in situations of significant asymmetries of power. And I was thinking, for instance, the case of the mechanisms of participation and dialogue that have been built in many of the developing countries for communities. But then these mechanisms get, let's face it, eroded or co-opted by sometimes private sector, or sometimes even the government, that actually decides to start picking favorites within the communities, and thus undermining the consultation mechanisms, and therefore eroding trust and eroding the efficacy of the mechanisms that are supposed to be to the service of managing the commons. So I wonder if I think there is a critical dimension that we should keep in mind when thinking about how to isolate these processes from the asymmetries of power that will necessarily interfere. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. And one more question here.
Hi, my name is Paul Flor. I'm head of the Interministerial Coordination Division of Government of Chile. And well, at the beginning of this year, Chile has taken a huge step in coordinating the response to climate with a new climate change law, with goals, plans, and several sectorial instruments. And we are now at the beginning of the implementation of this law, and we are interested in how do you see the role of the centers of government in this challenge?
Excellent question. Anyone like to begin? Yeah.
Sorry, was that question, what is the role of central government in...
Center of governments, I think.
Yeah. So I suppose we've just made our Climate Act last year, which has a legal requirement for us to reduce emissions by a certain amount, to halve our emissions by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. And we set carbon budgets. So there's only so much you can emit in each sector. So, so many million tons of carbon can be emitted over a 5-year period in transport, for example, or so many in agriculture. And we're doing those up to 25, up to 2030 and so on. And they are legally enforceable, so you can sue the Minister for Transport if they don't do that, and so on. So we've put in these. That's our central target, and then what follows from that then are the climate actions. So that's our framework. Now I think that we put it in, and people are saying, how are we going to make this? This is very challenging, but it was important to do that. Important to do that part first. So
yeah.
That's our framework.
Pretty clear role for the Centre of Government in establishing that government-wide framework, and then being able to assign different ministries and sectors to
And
it.
we didn't invent it from scratch. We looked at the UK. They had been very successful at both growing their economy and at the same time as cutting their emissions. So we looked at what was working there, just like every country does. You look at the jurisdiction where things seem to be going okay, and then we tried to improve on that. We have a Climate Change Advisory Council as well, which is a sort of independent body of people who are trusted, who are from different disciplines, who advise the public about whether they believe that the government's plans are realistic.
Great, thanks. Carrie Ann?
Yes, I was able to attend a meeting about a month ago that OECD held for the senior officials at the center of government, where they come together and they share experiences. And that was a really interesting discussion. I think Dustin was there for part of it. It was a lot about COVID, but a lot of the lessons, I think, carry over to any complex crisis. The challenge is that climate is a slow crisis, and so it's hard to maintain that urgency. But some of the things that were pointed out, the coordination across ministries, and much more frequent than they had ever done before. And I think that's probably true on climate as well. The ability to have more data in real time and to be able to communicate that data well. These were some of the lessons I think that they were trying to keep going post-COVID, but I think they're very similar to sort of what's needed with climate when you're trying to really move forward on action that cuts across the government, that requires behavior change, and it's just complicated and it's urgent. So I think those are very hard things. They're almost management things, if you will, but they're the basics that let you keep it moving, I think. That's what the lesson I took from that conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll follow up directly on that, and it's really interesting to hear about Chile's example on this, and I think exactly that, because we've identified essentially 3 symptoms when delivering climate policies. One is on detachment, which is a lot about participation, engagement. The other is fragmentation, and the third one is senselessness, so that the policies themselves don't seem meaningful in the context. So that's essentially a problem of creative policy design. But the fragmentation part is something that core of government, centers of government should very, very much focus on, which becomes an issue of coordination. But I would say it goes a bit beyond, so it's in a way orchestration issues. So it is management, it's information flows and structures, it's codification of those, but it's also leadership issues. So it's how to align on that direction, because it requires quite a bit of calibration when we move forward there. And that essentially what the humble governance example also was about, because what easily happens is that when you put your climate laws into roadmaps, you start to make guesses. And with those guesses, you start to use political capital. So you start to lose consensus by not having frameworks through which you can maneuver forward with trust that you're calibrating along the way based on what you learn. So those would be examples. On the co-opting of these methods, it's a really, really good question. Unfortunately, very little in terms of good replies. I guess it would emphasize the whole of society approach, which is very, very true. And it comes back to investments on the culture of democracy as well. I'm really happy to see that at least now there is much, much more explicit agenda on institutional innovation right now. And I think that's really good because it forces us to reflect on these issues more comprehensively.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Juste brièvement sur la question du rôle.
Just a few words regarding the central government issue. In Luxembourg, we have a similar frame to Ireland with sectorial objectives. I don't think that we could sue the ministers in charge. It is interesting as a system, but but there's an award or a watch which is planned. There are negotiations taking place when a sector is, doing too much. We have spending too much. For example, we have to balance various sectors. So we have a cross-ministerial group which is in charge of these projects and plans at the level of the government.
Concludes the session. So really appreciate the panelists' contributions and your questions. However, the dialogue will not stop here. So look forward to continuing that out into the next sessions. And I don't know if we have a time for when the next session begins or any other announcements you want me to make, Jillian?
Yeah, so the next session's going to start at past.
Okay.
In the plenary room.
Great.
Feel free to grab a coffee and a cake on the way in.
Wonderful. And special thanks to our translators.
I like that title.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been both a policymaker in the U.S. and in OECD.